It is said that when the great drought came to Dabari, even the strongest among us wept. The river, which had always been our life, shrank to a whisper of itself, its banks cracked and thirsty. The cattle, once fat and proud, stood with their ribs showing, and the millet fields, which should have been golden with harvest, lay bare, the soil hardened like a pot left too long in the fire. And yet, in those dry, hungry days, when men gathered in the village square to argue about what should be done, one woman did something no one understood. Every morning, as the sun stretched its fingers across the sky, Naima, the widow of the late fisherman Toma, walked to the riverbed. Her back was bent not from age, but from grief, and her feet knew the path well, for she had walked it daily since the flood took her family. But she no longer fetched water, there was none to carry. Instead, she gathered stones, smooth ones, jagged ones, small ones, large ones. She placed them carefully into her woven basket and carried them back to her compound. And then, before the eyes of the entire village, she did something even stranger. She planted them, not like a child playing, not like someone arranging a garden, but with the care of a farmer tending to precious seeds. She dug small holes, pressed the stones into the earth, and covered them as if she expected them to grow. At first, we whispered about it, shaking our heads as we walked past. "The poor woman has finally lost her mind," said the old women who sat under the baobab tree. "She plants stones while our stomachs remain empty," the young men scoffed. "Maybe she is calling upon the spirits," the more superstitious ones murmured, making signs to ward off bad luck. Even the children laughed. "Naima, what will you harvest?" "Stone porridge," they teased. But Naima did not answer. She did not raise her voice or defend herself. Every day, she gathered her stones, carried them home, and planted them, as steady as the rising sun. As the drought dragged on, patience grew thin. The elders called for a meeting under the great baobab, and there, they debated our village's fate. "If the rains do not come soon, we must move," said Baba Gambo, the oldest among us, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Our forefathers settled here because of the river, but if the river is dead, what is left for us?" The women whispered among themselves, already mourning the homes they would leave behind. The hunters frowned, knowing that the game had already moved to greener lands. Then a man stood, Dowdy, the blacksmith. He had always been known for his sharp tongue. "And while we sit here deciding, one among us wastes her strength planting rocks. Will stones feed our children? Will they bring back the rain?" he demanded, his voice loud with anger. The people murmured in agreement. "She is making a fool of us," someone added. "Or maybe she invites bad spirits to keep the rains away," another voice said darkly. "That is how it is in times of suffering, people need someone to blame." And that day, they chose Naima. A group of men went to her compound and stood outside her fence, calling for her to come out. "Naima, what madness is this?" Dowdy shouted. "We suffer, and you waste time on foolishness." Naima, dressed in her simple wrapper, her hands still dirty from the morning's walk, stepped forward. She did not flinch. "The earth remembers," she said simply. The men looked at one another, confused and irritated. "Enough of riddles," Dowdy spat. "If you will not explain yourself, stop this foolishness at once." Naima did not argue. She simply turned and went back to her work. That night, the whispers in the village turned crueler. Some said she was cursed, some said she had gone mad from grief, and some, like Dowdy, said if the drought did not end soon, it would be because of her. Then came the night when the earth itself seemed to stop. It began as a faint rumbling beneath the ground, barely enough to wake the children, but strong enough that the elders sat up in their beds, listening. A tremor, not an earthquake, but a stirring, as though the land itself was stretching after a long sleep. At dawn, when the people stepped out of their huts, the first thing they saw was Naima, kneeling in her yard as always. But this time, the earth beneath her stones was damp. The news spread like wildfire. People rushed to her compound, staring in disbelief. The stones she had planted, rows and rows of them, had disappeared, swallowed by the earth, and in their place, tiny rivulets of water trickled up from the ground, spreading outward like veins. The elders pushed to the front, touching the wet ground with trembling hands. "It cannot be," one whispered, but it was. The water swelled, filling the cracks, soaking the land. The people began to dig, frantically, their hands moving like desperate claws in the dirt. And as they dug, the earth split open, and a hidden spring burst forth, bubbling up with fresh, clear water. A miracle. The same men who had mocked Naima now knelt beside her, their heads lowered in shame. Dowdy, the blacksmith, was the first to speak. His voice, usually so sharp, was now quiet. "You knew," he said. "How?" Naima looked up, her hands still wet with the soil. "The earth remembers," she said again. She pointed to the hills. "Before the flood, there was another stream here. It dried long before you were born. But the land does not forget, it only waits." The people wept. Some laughed with joy. Some touched the water, afraid it would disappear if they blinked. But it did not vanish. It flowed. And from that day, Dabari never ran dry again. Naima did not live long after that. When she passed, the village buried her beside the spring she had uncovered, and they named it Moji Naima, Naima's water. And even now, when the rains delay, when the river grows thin, the people of Dabari do not despair. Instead, they tell their children the story of the woman who planted stones. Because the earth remembers, and so must we.